Okay. So I think this is working now. Just a quick explanation. So I'm kind of DIYing this, and if you see me looking down, I'm looking at this and controlling the ability to focus, for example, on the laptop or back onto me. So apologies if I seem like I'm losing eye contact at some point, but it's just really that. So this week is just really about introducing some of the nuances, some of the most interesting things around the concept of innovation. In about a month's time, we'll be publishing the 2018 Pharmaceutical Innovation Index, which has become the industry standard ranking of which pharma company is the most innovative. And most of the questions that I get about the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index are around, well, how on earth can you measure innovation? So I think it's important that we get to discuss the word, the idea, and the terms of reference that we are really using when we're looking at the pharmaceutical innovation space. Because I think a lot of people get very confused. They hear the word a lot. It's become a buzzword, like so many others. So let's kick off. I think I've used this slide before quite a lot, and if any of you are familiar with the Princess Bride, one of my favorite movies, inconceivable is the word that keeps being used, and certainly doesn't mean what it's meant to mean in the film. And here I think we have the same question. People keep using the word innovation, but I don't think it means what people think it means. And let's just illustrate what we really mean. And this Thomas Edison image, I think, is a great image, because invention is not the same as innovation. And I think we have to keep in mind these two concepts. That innovation is really about what you launch and derive value from. It's your return on invention. And the light bulb is one of those classic illustrations of this exercise. The light bulb's used as this kind of symbol for innovation, for the symbol for ideation, for the kind of creation of ideas. But as Thomas Edison himself would admit, 1,000 different iterations of that idea led to the final product that wasn't even like the ones that we understand today. So he very firmly understood the difference between invention and innovation, that you can't just launch something because it's a good idea. You need to do something to add value and return value from doing that. So I think we need to think about the way that he invented the light bulb. For example, the same way that Steve Jobs invented the MP3 player, as Stephen Johnson writes in his book. Steve Jobs wasn't the first, but he was the first to make something that took off in the marketplace. And that's a critical insight into what we mean by innovation. Something that took off in the marketplace is an innovation. Something that's just an invention, or that sits in a lab, or that never makes it to market, or in our case to patients, isn't an innovation, it's an invention. And it sounds like a kind of semantic argument, but it's not. I think we need to think about innovation as how you add value to your inventions. And by doing that, we start to focus on the things that matter instead of the things that don't. And we keep the conversation steady around what we mean by innovation. So this cartoon that I've, let me see if I can scan out a little bit. This cartoon that I've often shown is, it's seen as a bit of a joke, how to monetize other kids' science projects. But of course, that's mostly what the pharmaceutical industry does, is monetize other people's science projects. Sometimes still, they're our own science projects, but that's the job that we have, is to monetize, to derive value from. And this isn't to derive extreme value from or any of those other things. It just means how we're going to derive value from other people's science projects. So, and I think it also needs to be, borne in mind that there can't just be a hopeful bit in the middle. And again, this cartoon sort of really illustrates that point. Something magical happens when we come up with a compound that's druggable, that can go into man, and then over here someone says, right, there's profit. In the middle, I think we've got to do a little bit more explanation about how we're going to get those things, to patients. and to payers and to healthcare systems, because that's really how we're going to measure innovation. So we need to put a little bit more explanation into what goes on in the middle. And of course, pharmaceutical industry has spent an awful lot of time thinking about kind of innovation and invention up at the kind of preclinical, the discovery side. The bit where we're very interested in is, how does that invention make it to market? What are the processes of invention and innovation that could really begin to make a difference in later stages? And that then leads on to why we begin to measure some of the things that we're doing, because people talk about pharmaceutical productivity a lot. And what you get, of course, is again, in this cartoon that we developed, that everyone argues about where the hole is in the boat, whether it's in discovery, whether it's in R&D, whether it's in commercial, but actually everyone's going over the waterfall in the same boat. So it doesn't really matter where the hole is, as long as we're sort of starting to realize that what matters is, not going over the waterfall, but not worrying about where the hole is, but beginning to fix it as a team. So just to illustrate that a little bit more, you may be less of a soccer fan than I am, but there's this sort of classic game in the World Cup, a few years back now, where Germany thumped Brazil, and it was interesting because if you apply the traditional measures of productivity within pharma, you look at sort of shots, how many shots on goal did you have, how many shots did you have on target, and then you look at the at the final score, those very important surrogate markers of effect of the team suddenly meant nothing. As balls in the back of the net is the only measure that matters in the game of soccer. It's actually the only thing that matters in pharmaceuticals too. So when we think about innovation, we can't be talking about pipelines. We have to be talking about what you launched, because that's the only thing that matters to pharmaceutical companies. In traditional sense, not talking about biotechs here, but how many balls did you get into the back of the net? Not how many balls did you talk about, how many shots did you take, how many shots did you get on target, but which ones did you launch that added value? So the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index came from actually a very straightforward question. It was a question that we asked about 8-9 years ago internally, when we continued to research the best practice within getting things to market. We asked ourselves a very simple question: does anyone believe that if you gave the same molecule to two different companies, would that molecule automatically go on to be successful or not? And of course, we all recognize the role of the company in doing that. So clearly two different companies would have two very different approaches to getting that molecule to market and to success on market. And from that simple conversation, so often a great idea was born, which is, well, we could rank them. It might not be easy to produce an absolute measure of value added to the molecule, but certainly if two companies, let's say Merck and BMS, were to come to market at the same time with essentially the same molecule, to all intents and purposes, and then one outsold the other by 4 or 5 to 1 in the first year, which company would you say did a better job with that molecule? So that really forms the basis of the approach, and said, well, in that case, say BMS would have definitely done a better job than Merck. So in terms of ranking, BMS go ahead of Merck for that molecule. But then what else would matter in that conversation? So we asked ourselves, how innovative are pharma companies, or have they been? With that strict frame of references, how many molecules did they get to market, and did they get to market successfully over, let's say, a 5-year period? So we get a good historical look back. Phase 3 success matters more than phase 2 success, for example, in that ranking, because getting drugs to the regulators, getting drugs to reimbursement, getting drugs to physicians is all part of that consideration. So we produce the rankings every year. It matters who comes first. Over the last 8 years, J&J have had a stellar run through that period. Coming top, I think 5 years out of the 7 that we've done this. Biogen came top last year. Companies like AbbVie have continued to add strong value to their pipelines, hence the metrics. And if we need another metric, you think about a film or a book like Moneyball. The idea of measuring things that matter in terms of future success this matters, right? Which is, if you're the company that's best able to take your pipeline to market, it matters in a whole lot of ways. It matters to people who want to partner with you. So if you're a biotech and you're looking at two very similar offers, and J&J come in for you or UCB come in for you, one of them is much more likely to get your product to market successfully than the other, just based on our rankings. So you can look at our website. You can see the kind of the way that it came out last year. You'd expect some changes this year. It's been a very interesting year in terms of the way that this thing's played out. And then last year we broke out the contributions of what we would call commercial metrics from the clinical metrics, because clearly some companies, and again I think you can see this within the website, we can see the sort of relative contributions of whether it was your clinical department that made all the difference to the performance in the index, or whether it was really your commercial guy's ability to add value to the molecules, because they're not equal. So a company that comes top, clearly did very well in both. But there are some interesting splits as you look at, say, companies like J&J, for example, that did much better clinically than they did commercially, or some of the companies that are oriented the other way. This top right quadrant now therefore becomes this is a healthy place for everyone to be. If you're down in the lower left quadrant, a lot less healthy for your organization. It means there's something going on. And one of the things that we will publish before we publish the whole index is perhaps a useful indication of why this matters. We call it the Freshness Index, and it measures how much of your last year's sales, so 2017 sales in this case, have come from products that you launched within the last 5 years. Now that sounds like a healthy enough look back to be representative of where you've been recently. But let's look at the rankings here. You can see, for example, there's an awful lot of companies that are down in the 10% of revenues are coming from products that were launched in the last 5 years. A shocking number of kind of large pharma companies sit down here in this very low value add space. Shows there's a lot of companies really hoping that something comes through to save them, or that some acquisition is going to do this for them, because what they haven't been doing is launching products, or launching products that have gone on to be successful. So they're relying on old drugs. And if there's one thing that really bothers me about the pharma industry's reputation, next to, say, price increases year on year, is if your company is successful because you've got an old drug that you've taken price increases on every year, you might end up having the same profit number at the end of the year. But that's not healthy. That's not a healthy place to continue to be. We know that's where a lot of the pressure is coming. So the companies that we admire are those ones that launch new medicines, that go on to have, some commercial value. And today, commercial return is still the only indicator that we've got that the market wants what you just launched. There is no other metric that really talks about the value of your medicine other than did it make a commercial return when it gets there. So I think the index measures something useful, which is the ability of companies to take a molecule, get it to market, have it reimbursed, have it paid for, have physicians want to use it and patients want to take it. All of those are very useful things to be measuring. And it falls under the strict definition of innovation, not invention. So people say to us, well, wait a minute, what about, these guys are doing this really interesting thing with contact lenses, or these guys doing this interesting thing with AI. So, well, it's great, all nice invention. When it gets to market, we'll track it within the index. And that's the proof, you can't game it, you can't do anything about it. If you didn't launch it and it doesn't add value, then, it's nice to do the press releases about it, nice to talk about collaborations, all nice, but all invention. And we think that's an important distinction, because really it's how all of the kind of BS goes away and you start to rank what actually matters, which is your company's ability, and there's lots of different ways that you get there, to put balls in the back of the net. And you can see on our website again the kind of metrics that we're looking at, and all objective, all publicly available, all kind of useful ways of doing this assessment. But important that it isn't just a subjective measure of do we like CAR T more than we like kind of chemotherapy. That would be a subjective evaluation. So we've tried to stay as close to objective as possible to things that are indicators of your company's ability to add value. Because if a molecule is self-evidently going to be successful, we wouldn't need the index. But it isn't. The company's important, and the relative role of everyone within the company that contributes to getting it to market, the regulators, the formulation guys, the kind of drugability guys, everyone that makes a small contribution to getting a drug to market that people can get hold of, they can pay for, they can take, all matter. And that's why I think innovation is actually a more interesting space than invention. The creation of an idea, the inspiration, all of that stuff's nice. The perspiration that Thomas Edison talked about, that everyone else talks about, really is very important in this space. And again, more and more information that you can find on the website. So next year next month we'll talk about this year's rankings and why the companies that have been successful are there. But I thought it was useful that you had some insight into what we mean by innovation, and probably why we're a little bit sticklers for the literal definition of it. Because I get asked all the time to comment on people's innovativeness, their innovation profile, and it's hard to judge. Things sound nice, and they have a subjective appeal to me, but the question is, can you add value to that technology? And if you can't, you're not innovative, but you may very well be very inventive. So short live stream this week. Hope it's useful in terms of background. People I'd recommend that you read around on this subject. We've got some videos on YouTube with roundtable discussions around the difference between invention and innovation. And I think actually the good news is that talks to why companies exist. Steve Jobs, for example, was a big fan of the company, the organization, because it allows things to get done that individuals could never do. And the relative roles of all of you guys within the innovation space is critical. It shouldn't be left to guys who go to South by Southwest or CES and come back talking about drones and other things. That's not innovation. What people do to operationalize getting drugs to market successfully, that's innovation. So don't let it be hijacked by the creativity gurus or the other things. Innovation is hard work. It's discipline, it's craft, it's understanding how you do it. It's people that understand how to get a ball in the back of the net are very different than people that understand how to get the ball into the 12-yard box. So thanks again, as always, for watching. I'm hoping that I'm gonna get better at doing these over time. But if you have any ideas for things you'd like me to cover, always happy to kind of rant a little bit more or go a little bit more in depth about some of the things that we talk about. So thank you very much.